invite the speakers and the panelists to come and sit down here at the table, and I'll let them introduce themselves, but briefly I'd like to introduce them. This is Frédéric Desbiens, who is the IoT and Edge Program Manager for the Eclipse Foundation. Alois. Michael Maxey is with Zedata, who's a sponsor of the ARC Forum. Zedata is I guess a venture stage firm, or very happily well-invested venture stage firm that is a key contributor to an open source edge application, edge platform called Project Eve that's run by the LF Edge, part of the Linux Foundation. And they commercialize a management and visibility and platform for that edge platform. I have next to Michael is Valerie Viatkin, who is a professor at Aalto University in Finland. Valerie is one of the global experts on IEC 61499. In fact, I think both Valerie and Alois were using 61499 way before it was cool. So if the ceiling falls in here, we're going to lose a lot of the global expertise in that field. And finally, John, last but not least, John Conway, who's with universalautomation.org. They're also a sponsor, so you can see them in the showcase. They are a shared source organization that's working on a standardized runtime software environment for industrial automation, and he can talk about that some more. So that's the rationale for having these folks there. And I'll let them introduce themselves, but maybe I just did. So you're able to embellish or add to that as you wish, but I wanted to start with John, if that's okay. To maybe explain your organization a little bit, because you have a different kind of model than we saw, and talk about your organization and what you're doing and how it relates to these other technologies. And please speak right into the microphone so we capture the audio.
Sure, thanks Harry. Hi everybody. So yes, universalautomation.org, it's a non-profit association managing an implementation of the runtime execution engine of the IEC 61499 standard. Its members consist of users of automation technology and also vendors of automation technology, and they manage together a shared source implementation of this runtime. So it's not open source, it's shared source. So essentially, anyone can join and get access to the source code of the runtime. But there are specific licensing conditions and IP policy. In simple terms, in the license conditions, we want to ensure that there is one agreed version of the execution engine. So in fact, if members want to contribute and modify the source code, they have to agree that with the other members, okay? And we're doing that to maintain portability and interoperability of automation applets across the different vendor platforms. And then the IP policy, it's kind of similar to the OPC Foundation IP policy, where if members contribute IP to the runtime execution engine, they also provide a royalty-free license and the rights to the other members to use that contribution. So it's a protection for all the members.
Okay, can you, John, if I follow up with a question on that, can you talk about the relationship or future relationships between the Eclipse FortiEC and your runtime?
Sure, yeah, to be very clear, the universalautomation.org is just managing the runtime execution engine that runs in the device. That could be a controller, a PLC, an IPC, or it could be a containerized version of the runtime. We're just providing an industrial grade runtime to the industry, okay? And we will support other IDEs if they want to deploy to that runtime. So we've had some discussions with Alois about how to do that. There are technical scenarios to make that happen. There are no particular barriers. It's just a question of getting funding for the FortiEC project to actually be able to deploy from the full DAG environment to the universal automation.runtime.
Well, that got Frederick's attention. I think you're talking about getting some funding. I think he'd be interested. I would go to the other end of the table a little bit and ask Michael to talk about kind of your firm's relationship with open source and your business model, and give people a little perspective from your firm, Michael Maxey, if that's okay.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Michael Maxey here. Where's the data? We do edge orchestration and management. So what that means is we help our customers deploy workloads to the edge. And at its core, we have an open source project called Eve. Eve stands for Edge Virtualization Engine, so lots of acronyms at this show. And our business you could describe as an open core model. If you're familiar with the open source space, what that means is we have an open core, meaning part of our solution is open source. It's governed by the Linux Foundation. Anyone can come in and contribute to it. It's licensed under the Apache license, which is very similar to the Eclipse license, which means you can pick it up and put it in products and use it, et cetera. But our model is open core, so we have a commercial solution that leverages that open core piece to do basically infrastructure automation.
Okay, thank you. And Frederick, I'll turn to you now. Frederick has just written a book, or his book has just been published, but Frederick, I'd ask you to kind of introduce not just your book, but the role of the Eclipse Foundation, and especially in the industrial space.
Of course. Hello, everyone. So let's take care of the book first. So Harry was mentioning that it's hard to navigate the open source ecosystem and figure out where the projects fit and all of that. The goal of this book was literally to do that for the Eclipse ecosystem and a bit beyond. I learned from Michael that I'm the first one writing about Project Eve, so Project Eve is covered in this book as well. So enough. Now, yeah, exactly. Now, the Eclipse Foundation is a non-profit organization similar to the Apache Foundation or the Linux Foundation. And really, we are member-funded. So our members pool resources together so that we can offer build infrastructure and other resources to our open source projects. Now, a few of those projects you heard about this morning, so Eclipse for DAC, which existed before even the Eclipse Foundation in some sort. I mean, it's been around for quite a while. And the Sparkplug specification, where essentially, it was contributed by Cirrus Link, created by Alan Nipper and his team, and now adopted by our members in the Sparkplug working group, so Opto22, Canary Labs, Inductive Automation, of course, Cirrus Link themselves, and even we have a member there, which is Chevron, so you saw probably Todd Hensinger at this conference. And all of those people come together to really drive the Sparkplug specification forward in an open and transparent manner. And what that means is that I'm there as, the arbitrator or the helper to maintain a level playing field among all of those contributors. So we own the trademarks to Sparkplug, we own the intellectual property on the behalf of the community, so that no one can, run away with it and do something which wouldn't be open, transparent, and run in an open source way.
Okay, thank you, Frederick. And now I'll turn to Valerie. As I said, between Valerie and Alois, I think we have most of the academic expertise, or a lot of it, in the world right here at this table. And I don't have a specific question for you, Valerie, but I would like you to maybe share what you're taking away from this conference and your experience in both the academic and industrial space.
Okay, thank you, Harry. Valerie Watkins here. I'm professor at Aalto University in Finland and also at Luleå University of Technology in Sweden. And in our work, we are trying in research to investigate enablers for specifically for flexibility in different industries. And we selected very niche technologies. One of these is modular software design based on IEC 61499. and NASA is the use of wireless communication at the factory floor, and we're trying to combine these two things. And I must admit that I totally admire Alois's effort in the Fodiac open source development, especially admire persistence. So you are doing that for a long time, and it starts showing great results. And that's really great development. I must say that open source often can be perceived from industry perspective as unreliable kind of software source. But on the other hand, our observation is that we suffer with software anyway. The commercial software or open source software, it's all sources of pain. And users are fighting with that and overcoming the troubles and coming to some fruitful results after some time. So from that perspective, open source, I think, is a great thing. Of course, there are many questions which I would like to discuss if there is an opportunity how to transition from open source to like sustainable industrial, especially in the area of industrial automation. That's where we are all concerned about dependability.
Okay, that's an excellent question. I wonder if anyone on the panel has an opinion there they'd like to raise at this point. That's about a transition. I know, Michael, your firm has a model for that. Anybody else want to? No, Alice, go ahead. You'll need a microphone.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most crucial questions in open source in general. I'm reading a lot about that, seeing what other companies are doing. Your model with Open Core, I think it's called. Yep. Yeah, is a very good one. Also a dangerous one, but one of the better ones.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt and say I'm really not familiar with that model. I'm sure there are probably other people in the room. So explain what that model is.
It's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So the general idea is you have a core of technology that's in open source, right? Linux distributions will do that. Let me use an example that maybe everyone understands, right? So you take the Linux kernel that's maintained by linux.org, and then you add value-added features around it. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux, right? They put federal STIG, they do all sorts of value add around that open core piece. But the base piece is open source. And in theory, anyone on the planet can pull that same core and go build another distribution very similar to Red Hat, which other vendors may or may not have done. So our model is very similar. We have a core that's in Eve. We like to think of it as sort of a standard for the way to orchestrate applications on edge nodes. Anybody can pick up Eve and start to use a controller. We actually have an open source controller component as well, and kind of build edge orchestration. But we also have a commercial version where we've spent a lot of time with our customers kind of building robust and dealing with networks and dealing with enterprise compliance and high availability and security and all of these things that are the sort of value add around open core that people tend to pay for. So open core is the core is open, the outside of it is proprietary, and together it's a combined solution for an enterprise.
Okay, thank you. That's a very clear explanation. I appreciate it. Now we'll go back to Alice, and you said you thought it was a little dangerous or something.
It can be dangerous, but this is not for that podium. For both sides, for the company as well as for the open source part. But what you answered is very nicely also partly answering Valeri's question, because in that sense, with this model, you can ensure that we get the open innovation of open source. And at the same time, industry gets a tested, validated platform and an entity to go to for service requests, for reliability and all these things. And this is, I think, the model that works best. So with Fodiac, we are definitely not there. I think universal automation does that with the shared source model as well, because universal automation gives some guarantees to my understanding how the runtime will behave. Especially changes have to be validated and things like that. There are test procedures for the runtime in place. And therefore, this gives then exactly that what the industry needs. We get to say the best of both worlds is to have the open innovation, the advantages of open source. And on the other side, also the testability, the quality of service that you expect from a commercial product.
Okay, Frederick?
And this highlights this conversation something really important. Not all open source is the same in the sense that you can pick up a random library on GitHub. What's the quality of that? How's the IP in that? You have no idea. And you're betting on that maybe, or not. You shouldn't. Now, at the other end, you have organizations like the Eclipse Foundation, the Linux Foundation, Apache, and many others, and even yours that I didn't know about, but we should talk, certainly. In any case, I can highlight the difference by highlighting what we've done with Sparkplug specifically. So some people have been saying Sparkplug doesn't move fast enough. What have you been doing for the last 2 years? Well, for the last 2 years, the Sparkplug gang has been busy doing two very important things for the technology. One is writing an open source technology compatibility kit that anyone can download to validate their implementation. And the second is to have a fully featured, feature-complete open source implementation of the spec to go alongside that. So now when you go in the market and build those official Sparkplug compatible products on our website, from HiveMQ up to CirrusLink, Inductive, and many others to come, you have the certitude that they interoperate, but not only that, you have the certitude that everything is okay from an IP perspective. So if you want to jump into that market, you can pick up the open source implementation, adapt it to your product, and get into that market as well. And if you want the seal of approval, then you join the Eclipse Foundation and can join our logo program. It's as simple as that. And all of that is done in the open with open roadmaps and all of that. And it highlights all the difference between structured open source with a real governance, as we were highlighting, Harry, versus single vendor open source, which is better than nothing, but yeah, or random open source on GitHub. And those things are very different.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, in the time remaining, I'd like to open up the questions to the floor. I'm sure there's a number over here. There's a question from Dow over here. Alex will bring you a microphone. So.
While he's doing that, just to weigh in,
Go ahead.
Another really important consideration is the license. So when you're pulling something from Eclipse or often from like the Linux Foundation, it has a license that's designed for openness, but also for consumption. There are very extremes on these licenses. There's licenses where if you use the code, like everything that touches it becomes open source, which could be toxic for big companies that have proprietary IP. And then there's others where they're extremely forgiving and you can just sort of take it and complete it. So as you're sort of sussing out projects, don't overlook the license. That can be an important consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Cristobal Ruiz with Dow. I got two questions. The first question is just for the sake of clarifying the title of the presentation. Can you make a clear distinction between open standard and open source? Because I believe that these are two separate things that are worth pointing out. And then the second one is, what's your opinion whether or not open source could be a strategic advantage or competitive advantage for end users?
Okay. Who wants to dive into that?
I'm not afraid. So the first question, standardization versus open source, right? I think they're super connected. I think if you go back in time in the 80s and 90s, it was all standardization bodies. You'd have very big companies that would dedicate really smart CTO-style engineers to write these super long specs that then everyone would go implement. And standardization was something written that you had to implement. What you heard from the earlier presentations, they've all sort of followed that path, but they have a reference implementation. They have a binary you can run on Windows or a shared storage reference implementation. So to me, they're connected. And what you see, or what I've seen more on the cloud side of the world, is open source is becoming that standard. It's less about writing these lengthy documents and more about putting code out into the world to say, like, here's the right way to do X. And if enough people pile on and enough companies pile on, it becomes that standard and everybody builds on it. So I think they're very interconnected.
And I think I can speak to your second question, as I am a consumer of this. Having open source technology is very, very beneficial because I'm able to connect things a lot better. Within the pharma space, one of the things we fight with is the vendors and them building proprietary things. And it's very difficult to get data out of them. It's very difficult to connect it to the network. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure all that out, and we can never get everything off of it that we want. So having something that's an open source platform that can connect right into our tech stack, that we don't need to put much effort into, that very much increases our bottom line. I don't need to spend as much time integrating things. I can develop a standard that I can apply throughout my entire facility. So it's huge in that manner. I think within the industry, people hear open, and executives panic when they hear open, because then well, is there a security issue there? And what we're seeing, especially with the technology that we've deployed in our tech stack, is we actually have better security, because we have more control over it. So it is a huge advantage.
Renato, I don't know if your presentation was kind of a case in point, I think, but would you like to comment on how you feel about that question?
Yes, of course. From my point of view, when you contract companies like mine using a lot of open source, what happens is that your digital transformation starts happening faster. So, as I told you, it wouldn't be possible to us to do what we do without open source. So if your digital transformation goes faster with us, then it's because open source. Then I believe this is strategy.
Okay, there's another question here.
I have two questions that are sort of
They
related.
can come in twos, but not threes.
I mean, so one is about the supply chain implications and risks of open source, and the other one is the upcoming CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe, where there are all kinds of rules around paid services for open source software, right? I mean, around security. I want to know from the European guys, maybe, can you enlighten me a bit about what that really means? Because I read the draft, right? I mean, and I wonder how that would impact our decision as a big corporation to start using open source, right? Mainly for the supply chain risk, the Log4j kind of things we still have, right? And other stuff that we have. Any guidance?
Okay, so supply chain risk, and go ahead.
Yeah, of course, a secure supply chain is really important both for hardware and software, right? And this is why it's so important to take open source components with the proper governance. In fact, at this point in time, even considering all the commercial software in the world, 80 to 90% of all the code in the world is open source. Your iPhone is full of it, your Windows machine is full of it, okay? And those commercial players don't necessarily always give back to the open source communities, but some do. Anyway, the importance to know all that chain of dependencies for the open source components that you would use is really, really strategic from a security perspective. Because we've seen it with OpenSSL or Log4j, as you mentioned. Those were important dependency throughout the industry, but no one was investing enough to support them so that they would be secure over the long term. So part of our role at the Eclipse Foundation and the Linux Foundation is to support those open source projects like 4DIAC and the others. Try to find adopters for them and commercial users that will give back. And that's the thing. If you want, from a secure supply chain perspective, to be, in a good position, then there are two things you should do. First, you need to be aware of this chain of dependencies. And if your supplier is a commercial one, they should be able to tell you what's the bill of materials for their platform and give you the assurance that they maintain those dependencies and adopt the new releases with the security patches over time. And the second dimension is really to actively find ways to give back to the open source community. Because you can consume for free doesn't mean it's a good idea not to support it in some way. Maybe dedicate some of your developers to provide patches or even new features to project. Maybe it's by supporting a foundation like ours. There are many, many ways where you can do that, but if you don't, there will be another Log4j, there will be another OpenSSL, and you will be stuck scrambling. So why not invest 10K per year on an ongoing basis now, rather than lose 10 million because of a security breach in an important dependency. To me, it's a no-brainer, but I'm a bit biased.
One cliche I heard that I thought was very amusing is to think of open source not as free beer, but as free puppies.
But I love beer.
I like that a lot. I have to take that. I would like to add here to the comment, Log4j is just because it's open source, so you knew about it.
Yeah.
So if you have a commercial vendor, you don't know how many CVEs there are there. Maybe they even not tell you. So there is now there are studies on that open source will help you in that, because based on governments, on open communication, especially problems like Log4j, like other issues are much more openly communicated and also fixed faster. Maybe you already you still use some commercial tool that has Log4j with the buggy version inside. You may not even know. You are able to sue someone afterwards, but I'm not sure if this is what you want to have. So therefore, especially with all that things in an open, transparent way of communicating, a transparent software bill of materials with versions, everything documented, I think you are safer with an open source world. I'm again maybe biased here. And very important, open source is something where mostly about infrastructure, like with the open core module. So this is something that should not be forgotten here, especially in a setting like that. Also Harry presented it very nicely. Don't forget what is your asset, especially regarding software. It's the same with that guy here. He uses a lot of open source software. Nonetheless, he delivers value and he has a key asset he will never open source. And that's important. When you use open source software, you have to think about what kind of open source software makes sense to I would say like a buy decision, and what things to do by yourself, and it is very clear, do a strategic decision here. This is important. That's very often forgotten.
Okay, other questions from the floor? We have a few minutes left. There's one in the back, Alex.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to ask the exact same question that he asked as his second question, which was, are there any comments or concerns about the EU's upcoming CRA Act?
Okay, well, it's good to have a European-based organization and some Europeans here, so.
Absolutely. So if you didn't know, the corporate entity for the Eclipse Foundation is based in Belgium. This enables us to participate in EU-funded research projects, but we are a global organization and always happy to visit the land of the free, of course. The Cyber Resiliency Act, for those of you who are not aware what we're talking about, is proposed legislation in the EU that would essentially boil down to this. To have a software release, you would have to get the CE seal, like you have on your phone or commercial products at home. You would need to pass very, very thorough audits about everything about the software release before being able to release it. So this impacts commercial vendors, of course, and this impacts open source organizations. They tried in the proposed legislation to carve an exception for open source. But their vision of open source in the way it's written is it's a random person writing code in their mom's basement. And, you know, looking at my own members in the room, there are plenty of good people that give back to the community, but are doing open source from a commercial perspective, and even, I mean, on this panel. And the thing is, if you require all of those things that are in the legislation from open source organizations, this means we would have to stop distributing binaries because there's no way we have the budget and staff to perform all of that on the behalf of our projects, and our projects wouldn't be able to do it on their own as well. So this is a massive risk right now, and of course we are coordinating with other organizations to push back. But if you are from a larger organization and you have a government relations team or something like that, please get informed, please jump in, because this will have an impact on you even if you are just in the US and targeting the US market. Your partners, your suppliers will be dealing with it. This will drive your costs up. This will be a mess for the whole industry. And if you are willing to learn a bit more about this from an open source perspective, our executive director, Mike Milinkovic, wrote a very detailed blog post recently in the last few weeks about this. So we can be in touch, and I will forward you the link.
Well, it's good to know that the EU Parliament is our Parliament in this country is not the only one that's barking mad.
I wouldn't dare comment on American politics.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, I'm a very bad Canadian socialist, of course.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I wish it was happy hour now after that comment, but it isn't. Does anyone else want to comment on that? I don't know if who's familiar with it. Okay, well, we'll pass on that. Are there any other questions from the floor? There's one in the back here. Boy, it ruined my day.
I'm really sorry about that. The good news is this is proposed legislation, so there is still time. However, measures a bit like that have been contemplated even in the U.S. Congress, so stay aware.
Okay.
The other thing is, and that's really important, is that even if we get it to change, you know, things will likely change in that space. And the intent of the legislation is good, but we need to pay attention as an industry.
Yeah, very good. Okay, the question in the back, sir.
Firstly, I wanted to say excellent presentations and discussion. This is really valuable, I think. Question around sort of the business models you guys spoke about a little bit, open core, open source. Something that I've seen some companies be hesitant about with directly adopting open source is the support model with that. So for better or for worse, you go to a commercial company and you have a single throat to choke, so to speak, if something goes wrong. With some of these more complex architectures, something like, you know, probably Eric is aware of. I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of a support model where you're giving the product away or having an open core that you're sort of making available freely and then charging for enterprise support. Curious if you have any feedback on that model.
Yeah, I don't know. Eric, do you have a comment on that? I would start maybe with an end user and again, you're kind of in a different situation, a unique situation, but what are your support
I'm using this
issues?
stuff while everybody else is thinking about it at a very high level. So it's something that I'm still trying to process through. So again, working in the pharma industry, there's a huge burden of validation with anything that we put in place. But having said that, once we put something in place, it's very rare that we will change that in any major way. If I was to, and I've looked at this, you know, specifically with Codesys, of looking at online libraries for different control modules and pulling those into our system to utilize with our equipment. In the event that I would do that, I would pull that in and I would validate that myself, and then that would be, you know, what I'm looking at. And I would kind of take that open source as a starting point and use that to build off of. You know, that would give me a huge advantage, and that's where I see the benefit in open source, among others. But yeah, I'm not, from my perspective, because I don't want to change things too much, like I said, you know, I'm not looking too much for a support mechanism behind it. Now, that could be unique to my instance, again, because of my validation burden. So I don't know if anybody else has seen anything else in their use cases.
Go ahead, Renato.
Well, from the point of view of the business model to the final client, for example, when I embed a hardware with some kind of technology, I can use the business model that I'm renting the hardware. Okay, this is one business model that you can use. But you can also think about, for example, maybe it's easier to see, let's see, Spotify. Spotify is a software. And if you go to the license terms of Spotify, it's full of open source there. And you can see that Spotify is something like software as a service with the revenue model that you pay every month. Okay, so you can think about, I always try to look of some things that is already running to see the options that I have for the business model with my clients. So That's what I can tell you about business models.
Alois?
If there is still time, I would also add here. So I think it depends a little bit on use cases. So you've heard here now two different ways of using software. We have here Eric that is using it by himself, so pulling the software, putting it together. We have here a distributor, I would call it, taking existing open source software, packaging together, delivering value. And this depends also what you like to have. Are you building a product on top of open source? Then maybe it's more like Renato's case. Sorry, I'm super bad with names today. If you are a classic consumer, then I would see the Red Hat model. I think the Red Hat model is the most prominent one. So you go to Red Hat, say, I need a package with that kind of software. You make it correct, and I just get it, and you do 24/7 support and stuff like that. So, and for your case, it was the same. So we get here different kind of models, and this depends always on where is your use case, where is your value, what kind of software are you using? Are you building your own software? Do you need just software installed that it's working? For example, we have a case where we have a user of Fortiac that is paying us to improve Fortiac. So they are paying a few of my PhD students and developers to extend publicly the open source code of Fortiac IDE, and this is also a business model. So they get a better tool, and for them, the tool is just a medium to do stuff better. So, and therefore, that's the problem with open source. It's not like a one-stop shop and it's one size fits all. It's not like you go to Microsoft, buy a Office 365 license and everyone is happy. It's always a case-by-case thing, I would say.
So, and to kind of add a little bit to my previous answer, and thinking through a little bit, a lot of this stuff is very new to me. So I'm still trying to piece it together. I'm not going to claim I know everything because I don't. And there's a lot I've learned just in this conference that I want to take back. And one of the challenges that we're going to face in our business moving forward is how are we going to integrate all of our large-scale enterprise systems to develop a cohesive batch record, essentially, later down the line, and deal with problems like supply chain and having enough things on raw materials on staff and tracking patient info. Because, again, what we're doing, we're taking something from the patient, processing it, and then giving it back to the patient. So the implementation of open source solutions that somebody else has developed, taking two applications we have and connecting them together, that's a huge time saver for us. In the event that there's, we would like a support mechanism for that would be extremely beneficial for us from a company who is using open source technology and can maintain what they've developed on their own. I know that would go a huge way with management to really implement the larger scale things. So open source, there's several different ways that I can use it within my industry. One at the lower level for putting all the process controls in place and developing that kind of coding and whatnot, but then at the larger scale, connecting various systems together that somebody else has already figured out. I don't want to reinvent the wheel if somebody has done it better than I could. So in that event, to answer your question, it would be advantageous to have a support mechanism in place that's more formalized.
Maybe one comment that came, sorry, because this is very important. One chance of open source software is that you can very easily evaluate technology in an early stage. So you could go out and say, I would like to know how Sparkplug works in a setup of mine. I don't need to go to 20 vendors. I just go and get me the reference implementation. I get the Eve open core, test it out, and then see where this goes from. So, and then for most of open source projects, there is sometimes not as easy to find people helping you later to do support. I guess, especially as open source for our kind of industry is still, I would call it rather new, the way how there will be more organizations building up support for that. I know that there is a division at Red Hat, sorry, but stuff like that will come up.
Okay, I'm sorry to do this, but it is lunchtime, so I'm going to have to call the discussion to a halt. I have to go to another meeting. You can probably intercept some of these panelists on their way out, but I want to thank them very much for their contribution to this session. Thank you all.
Thank you.